Good morning or good afternoon, depending on your location. Welcome to Beyond the Score. Today, we're going to be talking about the identification of learning gaps through item analysis. So my name's Tammy Stevens. I am the Senior Manager of Clinical Product Support and Training here at Riverside Insights. A little bit about my background. I worked as an assistant professor of special education prior to moving over to Riverside. Previous to that, I worked as an educational diagnostician in the public schools here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And then prior to that, I was a special education teacher. So I have over 20 years of experience in special education and am very excited to be here today to present on this topic. So these are our learning objectives for today's session. I want you to walk away from here understanding the ramifications of the COVID-19 pandemic, specifically on students' academic development. And I know each and every one of you probably have experienced this and have seen firsthand the impact that COVID has had on our students and continues to have. I also want you to walk away understanding the importance of conducting item analysis when identifying students' weaknesses, and also gain an understanding of some of the features, or specifically one particular feature of the WJ and the WIP program, which is the intervention program that goes along with the WJ, and using those for pinpointing areas of struggle for instructional programming. Because ultimately, when we're using the WJ products or any type of norm reference test, what we really want to be able to do is walk away with the pertinent information we need to give recommendations and plan instruction for the students. So just a few housekeeping items before we get into the session. There is a handout that's attached to the control panel as a PDF, so feel free to download that and save it as you go through, save it before we exit out of the program here at the end. If we exit out and you haven't saved it to your desktop, you will lose it. The webinar is being recorded, so I know all of you are very busy, get pulled in different directions. If you get pulled away, you want to listen to it later, you can always email me and we'll be happy to give you that link. There is a short survey that's going to pop up at the end of the webinar. I think there's maybe 6 questions. Real quick, true-false questions. Really encourage you to complete that survey, because it really gives us some good feedback here at Riverside so that we can plan future webinars and also ensure that we're meeting your needs going forward. And then the last thing is going to be your certificates of participation. Those will be sent out automatically. You will get those tomorrow. There'll be an email sent to you from GoToWebinar, and it'll have a link for you to click on and download your certificate to save. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to talk first about some of the implications that COVID has had on our students' learning. And we know we've lived it, we've experienced it, we've seen the headlines over the years. During the time that COVID impacted us or was introduced into into the United States, and also the impact that it had on us as far as having to shut down our schools, quickly convert over to remote instruction, etc. So during the time of the shutdown and the high level of COVID cases, that we all experienced that, and it was very tragic. And as we move forward and as we have reopened schools, etc., we continue to see the implications or ramifications of COVID on our students, and not only in the areas of academics, but also in the areas of mental health, language development, etc. So there's continuing to be more and more research coming out around this particular topic. There was an article that was put out yesterday that was shared with me, and it talks about, the scathing new reports saying that American schools are failing the COVID generation. So kids who participated in that remote instruction or did not have the means to participate in that remote instruction, again, the implications of it continue to be faced by our educators and by our schools. So we're going to look at some of the impacts with regards to COVID-19, some of the causes. We know that academic school year of 2021 was perhaps the most challenging for educators and students. And to me, it's so surreal when I think back on what actually happened. Sometimes it almost feels as though it wasn't even true, right? The wearing of the masks, the shutting down of our schools. I remember seeing footage on TV where, schools were having free and reduced lunch still being provided to students whose parents could drive up to pick up that lunch. We had childcare centers, preschools shut down, and those that were open were mainly limited to those essential workers. And of course, with the schools being shut down, there were reduced services available to students with special needs as well. So when I think about the teacher challenges and responses, I'm impressed with the way that teachers kind of pulled things together and really tried to figure out how to deliver remote instruction. But, there when it first happened, it was really difficult. We hadn't experienced anything like that in our country in recent years. And so teachers really were struggling with how to instruct and communicate with students and provide that quality education and assess those academic skills and assess academic progress. There were individual approaches to instruction and assessment that varied, as did teachers' level of participation. I remember when the schools first shut down here in the DFW area, my granddaughter, parents, my daughter would have to drive up, get the work packets, and bring them home, and then work with my granddaughter on those. But after teachers figured out how to use the Zooms and use the online instruction, things became more interactive for those students who were able to log in and had the resources to log in, or had parents at home who were assisting them with some of that instruction. But some of the research showed that many teachers greatly reduced the amount of instruction, practice, and assessment that was provided to their students during that time. As I mentioned, some of the challenges for students was around their inability to access the materials provided by their teachers. Interestingly, only 40% of K through 12 students were in districts that offered any in-person instruction, and that mostly occurred during that latter phase of the pandemic. High schoolers have become more likely to drop out of school and less likely to continue with further education. Some of that is a result of those lack of skills that they should have acquired during those the pandemic years. I remember during that time listening to a podcast, and it was highlighting a school district out in West Texas, and they were following these high schoolers and talking about their experiences with remote instruction. And some of the teenagers had to go back, they had to get jobs because their parents had lost jobs due to the pandemic. So they were following this one student who was having to work at a at a restaurant or some type of ice cream parlor during the day to make money to help the family. And what she would do was she would log into her class on her phone, and she would have earbuds in her ears, and she'd be trying to listen to instruction while she was taking, customer orders and doing those engaging in those responsibilities of the job. So when you think about situations like that, it's like, how much instruction did she actually benefit from? So in April 2020, Pew Research found that 40% of low-income parents said that their children relied on public Wi-Fi to complete schoolwork due to the instability or no internet connections at home. So I do remember buses were pulled into different neighborhoods with Wi-Fi capabilities so that some of the students would be able to log in. So some other student challenges, there were approximately 55.1 million K through 12 students had to learn remotely or had no access to education. And as I said, the low income families were less likely to have access to technology required to participate in online learning. I do know a lot of school districts were handing out technology for students to use. But still, there were some districts that didn't have that type of technology. And then the other research that had come out was that low-income parents were more likely to be essential workers. So they were more likely to have to get up and go to work and leaving their children at home with no education support, etc. Weiss and researchers found that parental assistance and support of student learning varied as well. And then more than 35% claim that they are very or extremely concerned about their children's mental health. So not only, as I mentioned, not only academic, but also the mental health, the mental implications. So in early May, nearly 1/4 of parents reported that they did not interact with a teacher. So 1/4 of parents never had any interaction with the teacher, and then approximately 30% never received feedback from a teacher during that time period. And obviously, research has also shown that parents were overwhelmed by having to help their children learn and also try to maintain that motivation of their kids. So we could kind of go on and on here. I think, again, we all are aware of the struggles that teachers, schools encountered, students encountered, parents encountered, and again, continue to encounter as we move away from that initial emergence of COVID-19. So in 2017, there was an estimate that 25 to 30% of learning achieved during that school year is lost during summer vacation. So this is why we have in special ed, we have ESY services, extended summer program, extended school year learning, because we don't want our students who have special needs or have a disability to lose that 25 to 30% during that summer vacation. So we continue to provide them with instruction during that time. COVID-19's impact is expected to be similar to that learning loss during the summer vacations or greater. And again, we're getting more and more information coming out with regards to specifics on learning loss. So in 21, Dorn and colleagues indicated that according to the national average, students lost 5 months of mathematics and 4 months of reading. And that in and of itself really widened that those pre-existing achievement gaps. And it historically, it really hit the disadvantaged students hardest. Students who moved on to the next grade lacked the knowledge that's necessary for academic success, and then students who had to repeat a year were less likely to complete high school or go on to college. I know it's probably not a popular opinion, but I do think back on the pandemic and to see what's happening now with students, I do wonder if we should have made all students repeat that grade. Because what happened is those kiddos, regardless, whatever grade, especially those younger grades, where those early skills for reading or those early skills, foundational skills for math, are typically taught, they did not receive that instruction. So we moved them on to the next grade level, and a lot of these kids are struggling because they are missing those foundational skills. So again, Weiss found that the achievement gaps appear to be the greatest in early years, and most likely because growth in math and reading ability tends to be highest at that particular age. So Curriculum Associates, they have iReady. So they found that in-school assessment results of more than 1.6 million elementary school students across more than 40 states showed that students scored 10 points behind in math and 9 points behind in reading. So again, there's been a lot of research out here that it highlights these large declines in both math and reading compared to students' performance prior to COVID. So I'm going to flip through here. The other thing that was highlighted in the research when I was doing this background, collecting this background information, it was indicated that learning losses were not driven specifically by differences in family resources, but by differences in district and community level factors. So again, school poverty more strongly predicted performance and progress during the pandemic. Learning loss was also associated with remote and hybrid instruction, were larger in communities with higher employment rates. So these findings really suggest that remote learning may have been particularly difficult when adults were less available to help the students as well. Oops, sorry about that. So thinking about, we're now in 2023, so what do we do now? This has happened. We know our students are struggling. What can we do to really try to meet the needs of these students and really kind of pinpoint those specific areas of math, those specific areas of reading to ensure that, that we're providing the services, the instructional programming that they need in order to close that gap or catch up as much as possible. And, I think about not only all of these different implications that COVID has had on our students, the remote instruction, we've got severe staff shortages, lots of absenteeism, and that's something that I read in that article yesterday was since COVID, there's a lot of higher levels of absenteeism of students. The quarantines, not being able to interact with others, which has resulted in some of the mental health issues that we've had. There's been reports of increased violent behavior in schools, specifically at that younger age. And I think part of that is some of these kiddos weren't able to go to preschool. They weren't able to go to kindergarten in person, and those are typically the times when they learn what is appropriate behavior in the classroom, etc. And they missed out on that. But really, that significant loss of instruction is what is our main focus today. I know that we continue to suffer from severe staff shortages, and I worry about this a lot. I think about, what does this mean for our students who, again, they're in school, they're in face-to-face instruction, but they're being instructed by individuals who are not qualified teachers. What does this mean for a kindergarten or first grade student who is trying to learn how to read, and they're being instructed by someone who multiple subs that are coming through because of the teacher shortages, et cetera. So I really worry about the implications that's going to have on these students as we move on as well. So what can teachers, what can evaluators do to help pinpoint those specific weaknesses that students are struggling with and facilitate growth in academic learning? So one of the things that I think is very important for us, those of us who are using norm reference tests, is that we have to fully exploit the data from these norm reference tests. Now, again, these norm reference tests are one piece of the data, and they give us insight into, a snapshot into what the students can and cannot do. But I think a lot of times, because of the ways that we have been taught to utilize our norm reference tests, a lot of times our interpretation ends at the standard score level. And we end up leaving a lot of important information on the table that could be used to help drive our instruction. So one of the questions I want to pose to you, and I'd love for you just to drop this in the question or chat box, what types of data do you report from the WJ4? If you're using the WJ4, what types of data do you pull from the WJ4 to include in your reports, or to include in your interpretation of the student's performance? I'll give you just a minute to enter in the data that you report out. Thank you, Betty. Standard scores, RPI. Yes, I'm glad to hear that you're using the RPI. Percentile rank, good. Percentiles, RPI. Andrea, love it. Task analysis, RPI, standard scores, testing observations. Exactly. Those testing observations, and Robin, you as well, anecdotal observations. Those observations that you that happen during that testing session going to provide you with some very rich information about what that student can do and cannot do, and is going to drive and inform your instructional programming. I think a lot of times we get caught up in, let's report the score, standard score, let's report the percentile rank, but we forget that there's so much other important data that we should be pulling in from these norm reference tests as well. So I'm very proud of this visual that I created here, and thank you to Jim Cummins for, he's got a iceberg a visual that he uses when he's explaining BICS and CALP. But I like this because it kind of, again, really focuses on where we have traditionally focused our interpretations at this surface, right? So we report out how the student performed in relation to their peers, an ordinal measure. And then we also present out those percentile ranks. And that's traditionally how we've been using the tests. But if we really want to have a deeper understanding of our students' strengths and weaknesses, and what is necessary for, and what is necessary for instructional programming, we have to go deeper. We have to go below surface level to pull in the multiple sources of data that's collected from the school. We have to pull in those testing observations. We have to look at the RPI. We have to look at classroom observations. We have to go in and look at task demands. What are those task demands that are associated with each of those tests. When you think about, for example, you think about applied problems from the WJ. Applied problems is a test that occurs that's on the WJ achievement battery. But if we take a deeper look at applied problems, you're going to find that applied problems is not just a measure of math skills. It's not just a measure of Bosco. It's not just a measure of calculation and math problem solving. It's also a measure of language comprehension. Students have to be able to understand what the words mean and be able to understand what the questions, what is asked of them to do when they are when they're completing the task, etc. So language comprehension is a big piece of that as well. So when we look at a low score in applied problems, we have to go in and look at the task demands, and we have to determine where the breakdown was for that student. Was it truly in the math calculation or the math problem solving area, or was it that they didn't understand the language associated with the item? Or was it the way that the items were presented to the student, presented to them orally? Was it the way that the student had to respond? They have to respond orally. So when we go in and look at those task demands, again, we get a better understanding of students' strengths and weaknesses. And then also looking at not just the full scale IQ or the GIA score, but looking at all those different cognitive constructs that are associated with that feed into that particular GIA score. That's going to give us, again, deeper understanding of strengths and weaknesses within their cognitive profile, which is much more informative for us than what a GIA score is or a full scale IQ is. The other thing that I think is really important for us to utilize when we're assessing students is engaging in dynamic assessment. And I'm sure many of you do this, but with dynamic assessment, we're able to, again, get a better understanding of students' ability to learn. And dynamic assessment is basically where, let's say you give the analogies test from the ECAT. And I've noticed that a lot of young kids aren't necessarily taught the task or of completing analogies, and so they'll score low on that particular test. And so what you would do is, after you give the test using standardized procedures and you score it that way, you can go back and engage in dynamic assessment. And what you could do is put together a little lesson and explain to them what analogies are, give them some additional questions or sample items, etc. And then you could go back and kind of retest them on those items to see if their performance improves. Because if the student hasn't had the instruction in that particular area, well, that explains why they scored low. And we'll be able to tell that and tease that out if we engage in dynamic assessment. And you can write that up in your report after you report out those the standardized testing results. You can say, after engaging in dynamic assessment, the student was able to answer 8 out of 10 of the questions correctly. So again, it's much more powerful, much better information for us to include in our reports and to explain with regards to students' performance. So the other thing, this whole webinar series is called Beyond the Standard Score, Beyond the Score, because we've been pushing this, let's not leave pertinent information on the table when we're using our norm reference test. We can get some really good data if we move beyond just looking at the score. So this is a snapshot from a student, Wally, and you can see with Wally, these are the, here's the reading cluster with letter word identification, passage comprehension. We've got the math cluster with applied problems, calculation, and then the writing with the written language with the spelling and the writing samples. But we can go over and we could see here's our standard scores, right? So, 88 on the reading. Student scored a 94 standard score on the letter word identification. But remember that standard scores only tell us order, where this student, it's an ordinal measure, it tells us where this student fell out in line, where their place was in line on the normal curve when we compare their performance to the normative sample. So it's not telling us, the standard scores are not telling us anything about functioning. So really, if we want to understand students' functioning and understand proficiency and implications for the classroom, one of the unique features of the WJ is the RPI. And I was so happy to see that many of you put in the chat that you utilize the RPI. And this RPI is a score, is a criterion referenced score. And it's used to indicate proficiency and functioning of the student. So on that particular skill. So if you look at, let's take passage comprehension. Passage comprehension, the student scored a standard score of 81. But if we look at their actual proficiency on those tasks associated with passage comprehension, the student obtained a 53 over 90. So this is describing their functioning when they're asked to complete those comprehension items. So what that means is that when same age peers, because we used age-based norms, when same age peers would perform at 90% proficiency, Wally performed at 53% proficiency. So that indicates his proficiency is actually limited. He's going to have difficulty in the classroom with passage comprehension tasks. Look at calculation. Math calculation here, he scored a 76, which indicates to us, yep, that's a problem area. But if we look at the RPI, it's even more telling. It's telling us that when same age peers performed at 90% proficiency on that calculation test, Wally scored at 19% proficiency. So that's very limited proficiency, very limited functioning. That is going to have an impact on Wally in the classroom. So while the standard score tells us their place in line, the RPI tells us where that student is functioning for that particular in that particular skill. That information is telling, it's good information to know. But if we really want to start pinpointing specifically where we need to focus our instruction, then we need to go deeper into the data that's collected from the WJ or from any of the measures that you use. And one of the ways that you can do that is to go in and conduct your item analysis. When you go in and look at the item analysis, you're basically engaging in a process of investigating the student's correct and incorrect responses on test items, and it allows you to pinpoint areas of strengths and weaknesses. Again, all publishers tell you that we should always use other data sources along with the information that we obtain from our norm reference tests to inform instructional programming. So we want to know, interventions. We can want to know, things that have been tried with the student, etc. But this information too, from the item analysis, can be used to plan an intervention and plan your goals and objectives for those students who are in special education or meet eligibility for special education. So by conducting that item analysis, it's going to provide you with more in-depth understanding of those specific skill deficits than what can be obtained using a standard score alone. So that standard score can tell us where they fall out the normal curve, the RPI tells us where they're functioning, where their proficiency is. And then we need to go deeper into, okay, well, we know their proficiency is low, but where specifically are they struggling? The way to do that is to engage in item analysis. So there's a lot of benefits from item analysis. Obviously, pinpointing those strengths and weaknesses, obtaining additional data to use for selecting interventions, instruction, and then providing further support when establishing patterns of strengths and weaknesses. The only disadvantage to it is it's time consuming. So when you have to do it by hand and go through the process, it can be time consuming. And so I did this for Wally. So again, Wally's a real student. And I went through and I did an item analysis. I went through to see, okay, what types of, in applied problems, what types of skills did Wally struggle with? And what I found, simple division was an area of concern for Wally. Multiplication was an area. He had trouble with some of the tasks that require like time lapse. Simple division again, probability was an issue. And then as we go down where he hit ceiling, multiplication, probability, there was a item there where he had to figure out the median score, percentages and fractions. So that took me some time to go through, look at that score report, go back, look at the actual test to remind me, well, what was the task or what was the skill that was being measured for each of these items, and then kind of conduct that item analysis. Did the same thing for calculation, so same results. Had trouble with simple 1-digit addition, 2-digit subtraction without regrouping was an issue. And then he had some difficulty with addition with regrouping, decimals, subtracting and addition and adding simple fractions were areas of concern. And then he struggled with division with decimals. So again, this is really good information for me to be able to take and decide on specific areas where Wally needs additional instruction. And this is so important. I always like to remind individuals that this is so important regardless of whether the student qualifies for services or not. For those kids that do not qualify, we still should be giving feedback like this to the teachers so that they'll know how to work with the student in the classroom. So how can we streamline the item analysis process to identify strengths and weaknesses within the WJ achievement and the WIP? So this is one of the great features of the WJ and the WIP program. And if you're not familiar with the WIP program, it is the WJ4 Interpretation and Instructional Interventions program. It is an add-on program that can be purchased that provides you access to checklists for parents and teachers and students. There's an observational checklist, but it also includes instructional interventions. And those instructional interventions are selected by the system based off of students' performance on in each of those academic areas. So it was really created to help, again, streamline the process of linking assessment results with instructional interventions. And it was created out of the need for enhancement and quality changes in student educational programming. And so more than ever, the identification of those learning gaps are requiring us to take a deeper look into those specific skill deficits so that we can make sure that we are providing appropriate instruction that's going to help close those gaps. So in addition to the intervention programs, it does have a dyslexia report. It's got a comprehensive report that will pull in those score reports as well as narrative around students' performance, and it ties the results, the assessment results, to recommended interventions. So those, based off of how that student performs on the test, recommendations for interventions will pop up, and the evaluator can pick and choose which recommendations they want to include in the report. So it's available, the features are available for the COG, the oral language, the achievement, and the ECAD. So again, it helps us really facilitate database decision making as well. So what I want to focus, the part I want to focus on today with regards to the WIP is something that many of you might not be aware of as being available, and that is the formative interventions that are available for 5 of the achievement tests. And those 5 achievement tests have over 400 interventions, formative interventions, that are included in the database. They also have interventions in there for oral reading errors. So on that oral reading test, if you keep track of the types of errors that the student makes while they're engaging in that task, you can go put that information into Riverside Score. And if you have the WIP program, it will pop up interventions that are needed for that particular student based off of the types of errors that the student is making. So when we're doing our item analysis and we don't want to do it by hand and it's time consuming, etc., the system will do it for us. So there's 5 tests on the WJ, Test of Achievement, on forms A and B and C, that allow us to individually enter each item into the platform. So letter word identification, applied problems, spelling, calculation, and word attack. And as I mentioned, if there's errors from the oral reading that are tallied up and included, put into the system, Riverside Score, it will also provide formative interventions for each of those error types. So this is what it looks like. When you go into Riverside Score, I think typically we're used to going in and entering our raw score that we tally up, right? So we tally up our raw score, put that raw score in there, save it, commit the test record, and run our report. But if we want to really dig deeper into the item analysis feature, and we really want to be able to get a list of formative interventions that would be helpful for the student, then what we're going to do is we're going to select items. So we're going to click on the button here, items, to enter item level data. And when you click on that button for items, what you're going to see pop up is something like this. And this is the letter word identification item data. So this will pop up on your screen, and then you'll go in and you'll put your ones and your zeros. And it tells you here that items left blank below the basal will be counted as correct for computing the raw score. So it actually computes the raw score for you. But the system then can be able to do that item analysis and identify the specific skill that was missed by the student. So once you've entered your individual item level data, the raw score will tally up. You'll hit done, and then when you go back, you'll see that the raw score will be in that box where you typically enter that raw score. So what will happen with the formative interventions then, based off of the student's performance, the system will provide you with recommendations of formative interventions that are designed to improve day-to-day teaching and meet the specific needs of that particular student. So some of the, before we go into some of the examples of the formative interventions, a formative assessment is a process used during instruction to provide feedback, which is used to adjust instruction. Our formative interventions provide item level feedback after testing, which can be used to address gaps in learning and also differentiate instruction for that specific student. So based off of that formative, that item analysis, again, the system will identify those skill areas that the student's struggling, and then they will provide you with those formative interventions. So I'm going to flip over. Here's an example of a formative intervention that's part of the platform. And this one was for letter word identification, teaching closed and open syllables. So that's a skill that student was struggling with. And you can see here that based off of that student's performance, a formative intervention recommendation was popped up here. So John will benefit from learning about types of syllables, review closed and open syllables with John, explain that closed syllables ends in a consonant and has a short vowel sound, whereas an open syllable ends with a vowel and has a long vowel sound. And it goes on to explain how to implement that particular intervention. I know that a lot of times, a majority of the time, these tests, the WJ achievement is used when students are suspected as having a learning disability. But in times like this, when we have kids who are struggling hadn't learned certain skills because of the COVID shutdown, you know, I would entertain the idea of using this as part of our RTI process, right? If we need to go in and do more, you know, tier 2, tier 3 type of intervention, it might be helpful to utilize those core set of tests from the WJ achievement to really be able to pinpoint those areas where this student maybe didn't have instruction and needs intervention and instruction. So kind of rethinking too the way that we're using our norm reference tests. Here's an example of a formative intervention that goes with applied problems. This was for teaching simple multiplication word problems. So based off of the item analysis, that's the student had difficulty with simple multiplication word problems. So again, the formative intervention that was created by the system, you could see here, gives us examples and description on how to implement that particular intervention. So for Wally, the example that I showed you earlier, from the score report to the manual item analysis, and then using the system itself, has a strategy to improve mathematical word problems, and it gives you a specific set of items for what that student should be able to do. And then also the multiplication skills deficit. Again, the system will generate intervention, formative intervention, based off of that student's struggle with that multiplication. So I know we're all overwhelmed with, you know, the responsibilities that we have. We know that our kiddos are, you know, struggling with specific skills, and a lot of the struggles are coming from experiences related to the COVID-19 shutdown, and it's impacted our students' learning in traumatic ways. And again, there's significant learning loss that's been reported. So it's really our job to be, you know, go in and pinpoint those exact skill deficits from the WJ, if you're using the WJ achievement, and they're going to provide important details in regards to the instructional focus, and we should be able to implement those in order to help remediate that learning loss. Again, we can do it by hand, but if we really want to streamline that process, we do have access. We do have a software program, the WIP, that works along with the WJ achievement to investigate those areas of deficits and provide an efficient way to link the deficits, those skill deficits, to formative instructional recommendations. So make sure that as you're using these tests, make sure that you're fully exploiting all the information that can be gleaned from the test. Don't stop your interpretation at the test, at the standard score level. Get in there, look at the RPI. If you've not ever used the RPI, look at that relative proficiency index score. That relative proficiency index score is often better aligned with what we're seeing, teachers are seeing in the classroom, than what a standard score indicates. Because remember, your standard score is an ordinal measure that is not describing functioning. Your RPI is describing that student's functioning and that student's proficiency on that particular skill. Also, your testing observations, as was mentioned, is very important for instructional programming. Writing copious notes about what that student's strategies are, how that student went about answering questions, if they ask you to repeat items often, if they, when presented with a word, they sound out each letter in the word or chunk the word before they say it smoothly. That's all important information that you should be incorporating into your interpretation and into your reports. And then finally, your item analysis. Get in there and dig deeper than that standard score. Look at those specific skill areas that the student is struggling with, so that we can make sure that we are highlighting those skills and providing appropriate instruction for students, whether they qualify for special education services or not. Okay, so I want to see if there's any questions or any feedback. Again, when you log out, I really hope that you'll take a few minutes to complete the survey. Again, the survey is going to be helpful and informative to us at Riverside so that we can continue to meet your needs. Claudia asks, let's see, will you provide a similar webinar for the cognitive test? The cognitive test, unfortunately, does not, the WIP does not offer an item analysis, but we could definitely do look at item analysis on the by hand. But unfortunately, the WIP program only offers item analysis when it's used with those achievement tests that I highlighted. If our district purchases Riverside Score for us, can we purchase our own WIP to work with the district purchase? The WIP program, like I said, is an add-on program, and the cost of it is based off of the number of individuals and number of evaluators who use the program. So there's a tiered model for the cost. If you just had, I think for one person to use it, an individual, I think it's around $400, $450 a year. But then your renewal after that first year, I think, is like 10% of that. So you might pay a little bit up on the front end, but your renewal is like typically 10% for each year after that. So, you could do that where you purchase it and only have one person using it. I think the other tier is 1 to 5 users. But you can go to our website, or you can reach out to me if you want specific information on pricing. We will be sure to get that information to you. Okay. Let's see. I'm trying to see here. Yeah, Robin, you said that's a good question. I'm glad to hear that you're using dynamic assessment a lot. I don't know that you have to use the term dynamic assessment in your report. If you just describe what you did after going back into, teaching that little lesson or whatever, if you're whatever you're engaging in, I think just as long as you're given a description of what you did, I think it's fine. I don't think you have to specifically say dynamic assessment. That's a good question. So how are you determining that this student struggled with simple 1-digit, 2-digit, simple? So the way that I determined they were struggling was based off of their scores. So if you remember that test record, that the student had 1s and 0s. So what I had to do manually to conduct that error analysis was go back to the test items themselves and look at each of those test items that they missed to see what the skill was that they were required to do. And so when you look at those items, you can tell whether it's a simple 1-digit or 2-digit division, etc. So my point was, you can do that. You can go back to the test and look at those items. But if you really want to streamline it for the achievement, you have the WIP program that will do it for you. So that was what I was trying to convey there. Okay, and then the survey is going to pop up as soon as you exit out of this webinar. So I appreciate you guys taking time out of your busy day to join me. We have another webinar coming up next Friday. We're going to talk about, I think it's about observations. So hope we see you back here. And again, provide us with feedback so that we can make sure that we're meeting the needs that you have in the field. And again, have a great day, and we'll see you next time.